Good morning, everyone. May I start by thanking all of you for coming and for making it today. For those of you who might not know me, my name is Frida Nkirote. I'm the Assistant Director, British Institute, and an archaeologist. A lot of people who are here, they know British Institute very well, because they have benefited in one way or the other from the British Institute. It started actually for the reason of archaeology, although now we've expanded to all the social sciences and humanities. So it's still an institute where people can continue to benefit, and especially archaeologists, right? It was very easy for most of us to get funding to do research, even before I came here. When you apply for research money, you compete with taxpayers from maybe UK or America or wherever. But here, you're able to get a little money to do your research, and it has been very helpful. And I think a lot of people can say that. So let's continue working together, and I hope this meeting is going to introduce us to everything that each one of us is doing, and then we can try to do collaborations, find funding together, and move archaeology forward. Otherwise, I'm standing here to welcome you back, because you all belong here, and this is home. And we are going to start, even if Dr. Msaledo is not here. He was supposed to open. So when he comes, we'll give him time to talk. And then we have apologies from Professor Mutoro and Professor Wahome. They have been called for a crisis meeting because of the strike that is going on. And they're trying to resolve the problem so that the university can open. Otherwise, I would like us to introduce ourselves so that we know each other. And I'll start here with Professor. Okay, Professor doesn't want to introduce himself just now.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Emmanuel Diama from Michigan.
Good morning. My name is Simon Jala. I work at Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, University of Science and Technology. I am an archaeologist. Karibuni sana.
Good morning. I'm Kennedy Gitu from Kenyatta University, and I'm a child of British Institute.
Good morning. I am Purity Kiora, working with the National Museums of Kenya, and also an archaeologist, and I'm happy to see some of the very young people that have gone through the British Institute, the National Museums of Kenya, and we hope that we can move together in building archaeology.
Good morning, my name is Angela Kabiru, National Museums of Kenya, Archaeology Department.
And I am James Koome Munene, PhD student, University of Michigan, second year. I've gone through the National Museums of Kenya and the British Institute.
Good morning. I'm Hamani Kiriama. I'm an archaeologist and I work at Kisii University.
Good morning. I'm Busaka Bernard. I'm an archaeologist at Teaching Maseno University, Department of History and Archaeology.
Good morning. I'm Ibrahim Busolo. I'm an archaeologist and I teach archaeology at Pwani University, Kilifi.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Victor Minjili. I teach at the Catholic University of Eastern Africa as a master's lecturer. I'm a four-field trained anthropologist, and archaeology is one of the fields. I love archaeology. I'm also a child of BIA. I'm happy to be back again. It's great to see some places that I started seeing a long time ago. Some people who also connected me to BIA. It's happy to see you again. Thank you all.
Good morning.
I am Lucas Bwire. I am currently an intern at the National Museums of Kenya, and I'm a PhD student in University of Pau, France. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm John Munyere from National Museum of Kenya, Archaeology.
Morning. My name is Joy Kibi, and I'm with National Museums of Kenya in Prehistory.
Good morning. I'm Susan Ongoro, a child of British Institute and now at National Museums of Kenya Archaeology Section.
Good morning, everyone. I think I'm a bit different. I am a journalist by profession, but I run an online platform called Own Your Culture, where we study and educate about traditional art.
Morning. My name is Sylvia Emanya, Archaeology, National Museums of Kenya.
Thank you very much. Now that we know everyone, except for
Julia Stanley, I'm one of the graduate attaché students here at the BIA.
Okay, now that we know everyone, I think we will start. We welcome Professor Wadiba to talk to us this morning. Professor Wadiba, I cannot introduce him because I would do a disservice. All I can tell you is that Professor Wadiba has been my professor from when I joined university in 1987. And all the way he has mentored me to my PhD, and even here as an assistant director and an archaeologist, I always talk to Professor Wadiba, and he's always there to answer questions. So I consider all of you students very lucky if you're being taught by Professor Wadiba. He's now in a meeting. Karim, Prof.
Thank you. Although my second name is not spelled correctly, so I don't worry about that, I think. Thank you. I'm very happy. First of all, I would like to congratulate Freda and Emmanuel for coming up with this idea of calling us to meet, which is the first time that we are doing that. I think it is now that we have a good number of archaeologists, we can meet and discuss things in our own language, which was not the case when some of us started. And it is always good when you pioneer in a field and you see people coming up like is the case today. So I want to make a brief presentation, which I saw this yesterday actually. That's when I saw that I was listed to talk about past, present, and future research in the Kenyan Stone Age and Paleolithic. And my own interpretation was to give a brief historical account of where we started and where we are and where we are likely to go. So sometimes I don't know how to do these things. So I do this. This is like this. Okay. As we all know, Kenya is one of the most famous countries in Africa in terms of prehistoric studies, archaeological, paleontological, and there are very few other countries where these studies started towards the end of the 19th century. And I've listed them there: Algeria, where the French, and the DRC, Egypt, Ethiopia, Morocco, South Africa, and Tunisia. Now, some of these countries, like especially South Africa, has had a lot of connection with archaeological development, archaeological prehistoric, because even when the first fossils were found in East Africa, they were taken to South Africa for study, and so that connection between South Africa and East Africa started a long time ago. And the focus at the beginning at that time was on stone implements. The reason is that the people who are collecting these stone implements were not archaeologists. They were geologists or anthropologists. And they were intrigued, they were Europeans intrigued by these stone implements because the notion in Europe was that unless you had flint, you could not produce stone tools. So they were wondering, how come we have these stone tools? And you can see that the first publication was done by geologist Gregory in 1896, when he described the stone tools that had been collected. And this was followed, I think, shortly thereafter by Hobili, who was a cultural anthropologist, but also an administrator. Now, I'm going to make this presentation roughly in following those thematic or those themes. You have the early explorations and then beginnings of systematic investigations, Second World War period, post-war period, the recent and current investigations, and then future research. And these were or have been influenced, developments within these time frames have been influenced by what is happening either politically or in terms of theoretical paradigms. Now, the early explorations, as I've said, they consist of surface collections, mostly by these famous geologists, J.W. Gregory and C.W. Hobili, who people from Western Kenya will know was the first administrator based in Kisumu, the first colonial administrator. He also participated actively in pacifying people like my community who are resisting the imposition of British rule. And as I said earlier, the focus was on stone artifacts. And when Gregory published his first book on the geology of the Great Rift Valley, he also included a chapter on stone tools as were seen at that time. And according to this publication, they divided, mostly it had to do with the Paleolithic period. And there was what was vaguely defined as the Neolithic phase, which consisted of ground stone tools. But the best descriptions were on the Paleolithic phase. Now, and Louis Leakey, when he published his book, he used that chapter on stone tools as an appendix. Now, as we all know, Louis Leakey is the person who initiated professional archaeological investigations in this country. He was doing that for his PhD studies at Cambridge University. And so he started this in 1926, and he had 2 seasons of excavation, 1926 to 1927, and then 1928 to 1929. And if you are doing the tripos, I think as they call them in Cambridge, you also had to do a foreign language. And for Leakey, he decided to do Kikuyu as his foreign language. And because he didn't have a tutor, he was teaching the tutor, the supervisor, as he was learning, or actually he was teaching rather than learning. But that qualified him to graduate. And he published his thesis in 1931, as we all know, which focused on the Stone Age divisions. He established a sequence of Stone Age cultures and their relationship to each other. So he was able to establish the chronological sequence of the Stone Age in Kenya on the basis of his investigations in the Central Rift Valley. And this indicated a clear subdivision of the Pleistocene and recent times based on climatic changes. Because as you know, that time there were no chronometric methods of dating, so you either used geological phenomena or climatic phenomena. And Leakey, one thing we have to credit him for with is the realization that to do a good archaeology of the Pleistocene, you need geological inputs. And up to today, we see that many archaeological investigations normally include a geologist. Now, at that time, to explain changes in culture, people relied on the organic model, which was related to to evolution, and also used division or evolution. So Leakey, if he found stone implements that looked strange, he associated them with the Caucasoids, with the Europeans. They were the ones who must have either come, the ideas were either borrowed from them or these artifacts were imported. And then he tied these cultures to the pluvial sequence as established by specialists in that field. And using both the climatic changes and the geological sequence, he established a culture stratigraphic sequence that lasted for many, many years. It wasn't until the 1960s or late 50s that people started realizing that they needed to conduct more investigations in order to come up with new sequences. And he named these cultures using European terminologies, which was then current. Even in North Africa, they were using those European technologies, terminologies. But he also borrowed some terms like Stilipe from South Africa. And the Stilipe stayed until my own teacher, God rest her soul in peace, Papa Randon, carried out research at Prospect Farm and came up with a new term of prospect culture. Then Leakey also published a book on human faunal remains, I think called Prehistoric Races, I think, and in 1936. So 1931 he published his findings on archaeology, and then 1936 on paleontology. And Leakey was also very, very good. He was very fast at learning, so he learned. He had quite a lot of knowledge in paleontology. Now, during the Second World War, most of the resources were, of course, diverted towards financing war activities, and therefore there was very little archaeological excavation. Although, and Louis Leakey and Mary, who then he had married, if you remember, Mary Leakey joined him as a student, and then he he divorced his first wife, who was called Mary, who was also called Mary. The one Mary Leakey High School is named after, to marry the second Mary, who then became one of the best Stone Age archaeologists in this region. And so they were restricted in their home because there were rations for fuel and so on. But they still had some time to do what they relished. So this is the time they rediscovered this Stone Age site of Olkasali, which had been identified by geologists before. And they spent some weekends conducting excavations at this site with the help of Italian prisoners of war and various volunteers who were only too happy to join them. This time Mary also studied ground and polished stone axes and published a paper on them. Because Louis Leakey, in his book, if you read his book, there is very little on materials from the later Stone Age and also on the what became known as the Paleo-Neolithic and the Iron Age. Now, once the war ended, then there was some intermittent work at Olkasali, mostly by people who are employed as wardens at that site, with various levels of success. And Mary then conducted major work at Hyrax Hill and Yoro River Cave, and came up with 2 publications on those excavations with very nice illustrations. She was very good at the illustrations. And then you have first archaeological investigation at the coast carried out by James Kirkman at Kede. And so this laid the foundation for future archaeological research at the coast, which is still being done today. And one other important thing was for Louis Leakey organized the first Pan-African Congress of Prehistory and Quaternary Studies, which was held here in Nairobi in 1947. And I think at that time it was only the Norfolk Hotel that was available. And Mary Leakey published her findings or her study of what she called dimple-paste pottery, which was collected by Archdeacon Owen in what is currently Siaya County, and which we now know as Urewe Ware. There was between the 1960s and 1970s, there was marked increase in archaeological research, and in 1973, the late Onyanga Abuche was admitted at the University of Berkeley in California, the first African Kenyan to do graduate work in archaeology. He was helped by Louis Leakey through his contacts with Desmond Clark, and so he was able to get a scholarship to go and pursue PhD studies, and he graduated with his PhD in 1977. But before we do that, let's look at the 1960s. This is when Clint Isaac, who had been employed originally as a warden of Olkasali, conducted the first comprehensive excavations at that site using a new approach. Because originally, all archaeologists were interested in were the stone tools, and they will say, you don't need to explain. The artifacts will speak for themselves. But with the new developments in anthropology in the US, people who are now looking for other ways of interpreting and explaining their archaeological materials. And his focus was on total ecological, economic, and sociological context of the prehistoric behavior, because the ecology determines economy, it determines social behavior, and so you have his argument is that you needed to understand the ecological context of your archaeological artifacts in order to interpret them wholly. We also had coastal research, which was with excavations at Ungwaya by Kakman and Lamu by Neville Chitik, and you have seen this very big monograph on Lamu. There was also research in the early Iron Age as part of the BAND project by the British Institute in East Africa, led by Robert Soper, who was then Assistant Director of the British Institute. And the idea was to provide, because when the East African countries became independent, they realized that the only evidence they had of their history was what had been written by Europeans. And so they started programs in departments of history to teach students who are doing history some archaeology, which was called prehistory. And the first lecturers were John Sutton in Dar es Salaam, Merrick Poznansky in Makerere, and there was somebody before Barbara Anthony came, who was a Canadian archaeologist, who was in the University College, Nairobi, because these were university colleges. So, in order to, and then the emphasis was on oral history, which doesn't have enough depth. So, the British Institute started this particular project, and the Bantu being the majority inhabitants in East Africa, to provide historians with information that they couldn't get from oral traditions. And so Robert Soper carried out excavations at Kwale. He re-examined the materials from Urewe, and also conducted research in Mbere, in Meru County, and he was able to come up with the first comprehensive treatise of the early Iron Age. Now, in the 1970s, we had human origins archaeology with excavations of, this is when Mary Leakey, for example, did some excavations at Kubifora before the research that was comprehensive research, multidisciplinary research that was initiated later on. We had experimental archaeology, mostly, but this was done by students of Desmond Clark and Clint Isaac, people like Jack Harris, Nicholas Toth, Jean Sept, and Kathy Schick, as well as Diana Gifford Gonzalez, who did some work on the ethnoarchaeology of site formation processes. And then Nicholas Toth experimented with stone manufacturing, and Kathy Schick experimented on site formation processes. So Jack Harris, who I learned from, was conducting excavations on the Karare escarpment. This was how I was initiated into field archaeology, which was very interesting. And you have the delineation of the amount of artifact variation and how materials behave in fluvial context. This was his thesis. And then we had the first ethnoarchaeological research on ceramic archaeology carried out by Blackburn. The later prehistory was with the focus on transition from hunting and gathering to food production, which I participated in, and the excavation of later Stone Age and Neolithic pottery sites in the Central Rift, headed by Charles Nelson, who had mostly undergraduate students, including Stanley Ambrose. And then we came up with that. We re-examined the pottery of what we call later Stone Age, Neolithic period. And this is the time we introduced the concept of the Pasto-Neolithic. And then Stanley Ambrose re-examined materials from Elementaita, and we changed certain terms like Capsian and so on. Then in the 1980s through the 1990s, we had further human origin studies and experimental archaeology, further investigations into coastal archaeology by people like Henry Mutoro, George Abungu, we also had zooarchaeology with the most comprehensive done by Kareka Munene. We had obsidian sourcing. The first was done by Harry Merrick and Frank Brown, which was quite interesting because they were able to delineate, even on the basis of color, the sources of obsidian within the Nakuru-Naivasha basin. And when we were conducting research in Mount Elgon with Chap Kusimba, we were able to determine the sources of these materials. Now, recent and current investigations, we have emphasis on subsistence and diet, which we can consider to be something fairly recent in terms of Kenyan archaeology. We have underwater archaeology by my former student who unfortunately is not with us today, and we had hoped that he was going to be here. We have ceramic technology, the kind of work that is done by Freda here, because for us, like in my case, although I looked at a few aspects of technology, I didn't do a comprehensive analysis like Freda was able to do for her PhD, and it is a very interesting document to read. We have settlement archaeology, done by Ben Nyanjoka, for example, and landscape archaeology by people who are sitting here, so they will be talking about that. It's continued work on obsidian sourcing. We have zooarchaeology by some of the presenters. So the future research, these are areas I think that still have a lot of potential, like human origins, archaeology. I think we need to expand the geographical scope of these investigations. Underwater archaeology is still in its infant stages, and we do hope that we can get more students opting for this particular subfield. The transition between the Middle Stone Age and the Late Stone Age, which some people have been working on for ages, but they have refused to complete. So I do hope that they will be able to complete this time. Ceramic technology is still very attractive. We need to apply new techniques, we have one undergraduate student in our institute who has used new technology to look at hardness on pottery. For us, we were told if you scratch the pot with your fingernail, then you can say it is soft. But now there is a scientific way of determining the hardness, and you can categorize the various types of hardness. Yeah, we need archaeological conservation. I think we have lots of archaeological materials which have not been conserved, or if they have not been properly done. And we have new ways of conserving archaeological materials. So I think that this is another area that we need to focus on. Ethnoarchaeology is important. And I don't want to preempt what I'm going to say in my next presentation, so I'll leave it at that. And I think we need to do the kind of things that the National Museums, UNESCO, and British Institute were able to do in Meru County. We need to look again at exchange systems using ceramics and stone tools. We need paleobotany, paleobotanical studies, which I think we had very little of. So thank you very much for your presentation. For your attention. That was one presentation.
Thank you very much, Prof.
Okay.
I'm an old student of archaeology, but I've learned a lot today from all the history of how all this began and how far it has gone. And I think there's a challenge there for the new archaeologists coming up. You've seen all the future that we have in front of us that any of you can start working on. And for now, I'll open the floor for anyone with a question to Prof. We can take questions now. Yes, Purity.
Prof, thank you very much for your presentation. I remember, was it last year? I think sometime last year, I had been requested to give a talk in South Africa in regards actually to the history of the Stone Age cultures. And I can tell you I had to run around looking for information. The amount of books I had to read just to get the glimpse of what you've given us today. I wish I had just called you, or you'd have given me everything, but thank you very much. In your presentation, I didn't hear you talk much about the other countries, like in Uganda and Tanzania and Ethiopia, because I believe they also shaped the history of archaeology within that time period. And also in terms of the terminologies, I know there was a whole debate and history of how different terminologies were coined during that whole period, especially from the 60s going all the way to the to what we have currently, like what we can boost we have in terms of the terminologies in archaeology. So I don't know whether you can just tell us a little bit about how other countries were involved and also how terminologies kept changing during that period.
Prof, would you like to answer one or it's in collective? You can.
Okay. He wants to ask.
Thank you very much, Prof. I think you have taken us through what happened so that we have known where we have come from, where we are currently, and where we are going. And I think it is very important for us to know that, because I think most of us may not know what you have talked about, what you have given us today. Towards the end of your talk, you mentioned the use of new techniques in archaeological work. And when you were starting your talk, you mentioned how people were doing archaeology and how things improved, which made the study of archaeology to be up to standards compared to other parts of the world. And I think it has improved. But when you come to the new techniques that are being applied now, I was wondering whether you can share with us how best can we approach this front, because we realize that as a country and as a people doing archaeology, we are kind of disadvantaged. The new techniques come and we don't have, for example, the GIS machines. We don't have the other machines that are needed to do archaeological work to the standard that is required. I'm saying this because I visited a lab in Liverpool University, and what they have there is so much, and it makes their work very easy, while here we don't have such things. I know as archaeologists we collaborate with the others coming from those developed universities or the West, but in the end we get the West getting the credit, and we as Kenyans, as professionals, we are left in the dark. How best can we approach this issue of new techniques to be applied? Because for us to rise up to the standards, we need to get into that particular area. Thank you very much.
One more question before Prof. Victor Pastori.
And mine is very simple. Do you think we are where we are supposed to be in terms of the people trained and what we are doing in this country?
Thank you. I'll start with the last one. Do I think we are where we are? That is simple, yes. We are where we are. I think the question should be, are we where we should be?
That's what he has asked, actually.
Okay. Are we where we should be? You see, everything whatever you do is in comparative terms. And you can only do what you can do using the available resources. So as far as I'm concerned, as Kenyans, as Kenyan archaeologists, we are not too badly off. Looking at two main things: funding for research in general is very limited, and it is much more limited for those disciplines which are considered to be peripheral to the overall socio-economic development of the country. And who determines that? Is the politicians. So, and then two is the problem of training. If you look at the University of Nairobi, the University of Nairobi started a master's program in 1975. But if you go to the Department of History and Archaeology, what do you see there? That says that this university teaches archaeology. Nothing. The national museums has for a long time focused on paleontology because of Richard Leakey's interests. And Frida is a very good example because she worked in the National Museum for years and years with her first degree. And nobody was bothered to take her up. People who had stopped in Form 6 and were working in paleontology had opportunities to go and study. Even when we had the first archaeologist as head of that institution, there were no benefits to that division. We used to call it Division of Archaeology. I don't know. You demoted it to a department. I was heading the division. Now you head the department. So that is the problem. So we have then, that means that unless you go out, you won't even be exposed to the new technologies that I'm talking about. When Purity joined us, for those of you who don't know, Purity, her first degree was in geology before she was inducted and forced to become an archaeologist, which fortunately she enjoys. But that is, I think to us that was a plus, to have somebody with a geological background doing archaeology. And then she went on to do something that is new, isotope analysis. Some of the things we can do using very basic equipment. Others we need more sophisticated equipment. So maybe these kinds of meetings will help us to shape the future of archaeology. Unless you meet and exchange ideas, you remain the way you are, just like some professors never read beyond their PhDs. So that is the unfortunate thing. And that ties in with what Dr. Onjala said. Now, Dr. Onjala and I were classmates for quite some time. And he was among the first people to look at settlement archaeology, the Ohingini. And in a sense, he has continued with that. Now, what new, because like when Henry Mutoro was doing his research, he used nearest neighbor analysis, which is a technology developed or a system developed by geographers. And so what is the new techniques? Where is the equipment? Some of the basic equipment that we had, like the Chinese, when Louis Tilmiap started, donated petrological microscopes. And Herman Kiriyama here did his dissertation on ceramic technology using a petrological microscope. Now, is there any petrological microscope in the museum? No. Even if the Chinese microscopes had been kept, they will now be obsolete. But who thinks about acquiring that basic microscope, even just one? No, nobody. So the problem is we are aware of the equipment, but we do not prioritize their acquisition. But when Onyango Abuche was doing his fieldwork in the Central Rift, the museum didn't have survey equipment. He borrowed the equipment from the Department of Survey at the University of Nairobi. The problem I've seen, especially with you young people, is to think that if you go and tell somebody that you are doing this research, they will either take it from you. You know, you have become so individualistic. How many? Purity has just amejishtaka tu mwenyewe. She conducted excavations in Karura. The first time I saw the artifacts was when she was showing Stanley Ambrose. So how can you know? Unless you network. And I think Freda and Emmanuel were thinking about networking before they came up with this workshop. So if we don't have the equipment, it is probably somewhere within our universities. So we should be able to use that equipment. When I was doing my PhD, even in Europe, all we had were computer frames. Computer frames. So you punched, you came up with a program, you punched the program into cards, then you went and surrendered the cards to the computer lab, which was the case even here. When I met Professor Kechaka the first time, when I was in South Africa, he was doing his sabbatical there. And we met in the computer lab. He had his punch cards, I also had mine. So I think that's what we need to do. Is this equipment available? Sometimes the problem is that those people who have the resources don't want to share. I have had problems with the National Museum Library because the librarian doesn't know there is a concept called interlibrary loaning system. So I have an office. Even the books, she told him, our librarian, when I wanted her to go and borrow a book from me, she said, I know this book was bought by Professor Wandiwe, but I'm not going to allow you to borrow it. So we have to learn to share the resources that we have. Now, other countries, I deliberately left them out because the focus was on Kenya. But I know, like, even if some of the terminologies that were used by Iliki were borrowed from Uganda. And we also have had some influence from Ethiopia. And we still have collaboration, or in fact, the Kubifora, TPI, in a sense, has captured that concept of working with our neighbors. The project we had also in conservation, which was called archaeological collections, was a very good one. And the museum killed it because they thought there was a lot of money. So they wanted to take over the project without knowing how the money was being brought in. And it died. But it is true, you see, the other thing I left out was rock art, which we also have had a fairly long history of looking at, like we have rock art around Elgon, Cramley, when he was doing his PhD research in Kenya Hills, also encountered that. So I'm aware of the contribution that other countries have made to our archaeological investigations, but I didn't think that it mattered a lot if I didn't include that. But it's a good point. Thank you.
But Prof, my main question was about, like, if you think about the terminologies we use today, like Neolithic, Pleistocene, Middle Stone Age, those are not the same terminologies that are used in Europe. And I'm sure most of these young people may not understand why that difference came about.
The Neolithic is a concept we borrowed from Europe. The Neolithic is an international concept. The way the Neolithic was defined originally was an economy that had domestic animals and plants, that had pottery and polished stone tools. So the new Neolithic is new stone, and the new stone was the polished stone artifacts, polished stone axes and sickles. Until excavations in Jerusalem revealed that there was a Neolithic before the invention of pottery. So they started talking of pre-pottery Neolithic. Now, Onyanga Abuche is the one who argued that there must be a Neolithic, there must have been a Neolithic in East Africa, because they were saying there was no Neolithic in East Africa. And that's why now we came up with that concept of pastoral Neolithic, because we have domestic animals. And the lack of evidence for plants should not deny the application of that terminology to the archaeology of East Africa. And the terminologies change. Terminologies change. Just like interpretations of archaeological materials and the paleontological materials change. When Carlton Thompson did work at Great Zimbabwe, the argument was that Africans were not intelligent enough to come up with that structure. So it must have been Caucasoids. Now we know that that's not correct. The things that Louis Leakey thought had been invented by Europeans, we no longer think of that. So terminology, we had the Tumbian culture. How many of you have heard of Tumbian culture? Exactly. So maybe, as you are suggesting, we need now to go into that, the evolution of archaeological terminologies. Charles Nelson is the one who came up with the SASE system. He's the one who came up with the SASE system. And he was commissioned by the Pan-African Association of History and Quaternary Studies. And he came up with that system, which we use. And when we started the Urban Origins Project, Kenya was the only one using that system. So I sent Munyiri to the National Museums in Dar es Salaam to teach them about the SASE system.
Before that, I just wanted to ask Prof, in line with what Ojala asked about technology. I know for sure you talked about oral traditions, and our histories here, they are passed on through oral traditions, and if archaeology can add value to oral traditions, it's through material culture. And one thing that is not really looked at here is genetics. And I'm wondering how, because sometimes you see, if you go to like to the international conferences, you hear them talking about Bantu, and they saw Busia somewhere in the map, and then when you look again, you'll see it somewhere in West Africa, and they are being related to people in Southern Africa, and then the Kikuyu somewhere, you know. So it's a bit confusing how genetics are being done, and how can we position ourselves as Kenyan archaeologists to try and probably work with people who are doing genetics, or which direction should we take in terms of that? Because I think we need to write our own histories, and we are able to do that if we can do genetics and study material culture in a different way.
Yes, sometimes when you go to this international meeting, sometimes you wonder whether the person making a presentation really knows what they are talking about. For many people out there, Kenya could as well be where Chad is, isn't it? You know, I remember when I was a student in the UK, and during apartheid and the Zimbabwe war, and that is what was on BBC TV. So, you know, people ask me, "Are you sure your family is safe?" We saw a lot, you know, these warriors killing people. Are you sure your family is safe? Where did you see? In South Africa. I tell them South Africa is 6,000 miles away from my home. So I think the problem, you see, with genetics, we have a department of genetics here in the museum, isn't it?
There is, yes.
They are already there. Yes. So maybe this is where collaboration in research comes in. Whatever you want to do, then you can collaborate with other related disciplines, because as an archaeologist you will not be in a position to carry out that, but genetics could do that. So you tell them what you are interested in, and then request if they could collaborate with you in that research. I think that is my own view.
I think also the other problem is that as much as we want to do interdisciplinary, like we have a big botanic department in the museum.
The herbarium.
Yes.
Is the biggest.
They are not able to look at the archaeological charred seeds, because their data bank doesn't have that. So one wonders, even in genetics and DNA, are they able to handle archaeological materials, for example?
Yeah.
I think that is where the challenge is.
Yeah, that is where also, because there are these techniques you can learn as an archaeologist. I learned how to make thin sections. I learned how to grind a pot and derive heavy minerals from it, and use a microscope to determine the nature of the rock. So it's a skill you can acquire, and maybe we want to encourage some of the young people, instead of like I'm doing in anthropology. Why do you have to talk about socio-cultural every time, socio-cultural, when there are so many other issues in cultural anthropology that you can look at? And maybe this is where we now deliberately, because for me, I was deliberately forced to get into ceramics, simply because the person who was supposed to do the ceramics did not come. So So Anyango Abuja, in his wisdom, said, "Simi, you take this opportunity." So there are many of these young people who are interested. So if we could get them training in that area, and as you rightfully say, sometimes these other professionals may not be able to give you the kind of information that you as an archaeologist are interested in. But if you have your own, it's very easy. It's very easy. Well, I'm sure Kiriama has not forgotten how to make a thin section. He can still make a thin section. If he has the equipment to make the thin section and the microscope to determine the nature of the clay. So I think that is a very good observation, and maybe that's what we need to do.
Thank you for that presentation. Your class was spoke, but it was on the other side of the
where I am.
I like those two things. What you're saying, the child was trying to do the genetic mapping across the population. And I'm also trying to do it with a student from Norway. And I'll talk with that later. We have been trying to do that. But the problem I've been getting is because to get the DNA from the ancient bones is a technique which you have to learn, and which we have not learned. And at our age, I don't know if to learn that. But as Prof said, I think the younger guys need to learn how to extract the DNA from ancient populations, because it's not an easy thing. Once you do that, then you can have to do that. And it's right that we have been talking about these populations, but we don't know which these populations are because we don't have the genetic makeup. We don't know when you talk about a coastal person, whether it's really a coastal person or not. So we are trying to do that, and we hopefully will come up with an answer. But Prof, I was thinking, when you were talking about future research, there's this issue of critical heritage which is coming up. And like in our country, we're having these problems of identity, who you are. What role do you think archaeology, especially when you talk about heritage studies, what role can it play in bringing social cohesion and also in trying also in sustainable development? And all those issues which we should also look, instead of looking at archaeology, like when you are teaching us, we looked at archaeology, and that's why a few of us were doing archaeology, because there was no money coming in. But don't you think we need to look also at archaeology studies with sustainable development?
I think that should be the last one.
Okay. Thank you. It is a great honor to have an elder of Professor Wandiba speak to us. Thank you so much, Professor, for your presentation. I have two questions related to what the other questions that have been asked. One is about the classifications that we've been talking about. You didn't talk about the way we classify stone tools. There are those who talk of early Stone Age, middle Stone Age, late Stone Age, blah, blah. And there are those who talk of mode 1, mode 2, mode 3, blah, blah, blah. What do you think about these classifications? Question 2. As an elder, I'm sure you understand the enigma in reconstructing, the Neolithic cultures. And the problem comes with how different cultures are interacting and overlapping. You find that material cultures, they're overlapping. In the sense that if you're interested in the origins of domestication of plants and animals in Eastern Africa, it's really a big problem to see how farmers are coming in, how pastoralists are coming in. As an elder, which is the best way that you can suggest for handling this topic? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wandiba. In fact, I'm so grateful to meet you this year. Because the last time I met you was 1983-84, when I was a student and you were giving a talk on pottery at Kenyatta University. I was a student by then. And perhaps that is why I got some inclination towards archaeology with Mudoga. Myself, I'm in religious studies. I'm not in archaeology, but I have interest in archaeology. There are one or two things. I was a bit late in your presentation. The first one is sometime back I was reading on archaeology in terms of stone walls across Africa and elsewhere, and somebody wrote an article on writings which need to be deciphered in some of the stone walls across the world. And this might also give a light to some of the archaeologists who might be working on stone walls, that Timli Chohinga is having some 4 writings which have not been deciphered. I don't know, I tried looking at any writings related to that particular writing on the Western Gate, and I couldn't get it at all. You've touched on underwater archaeology as one of the areas of the future. And presently, I'm coming from Uyoma in Bondo. I'm trying to write on, to compile genealogical family trees of the region. And as I move on, I've found issues related to archaeological research which may need to be captured. Since you have talked of underwater archaeology, there has been a trend in the recent past of findings of military hardware within Lake Victoria Basin. And this military hardware is also compounded with some findings of fossils, especially on an island just across Beta Point. The undercurrent normally brings some fossils, deposits. These people capture them, but since they don't see the importance of these fossils, they simply release them and let them go. In the same region, there has been a lot of findings of either they might be Arabic materials in porcelains, the earliest slave trade materials, which are within that region, which need to be captured. So as you talk about the future of archaeology, I believe there is a lot more to be done. In some areas where there has been a lot of excavation due to quarrying, sometimes they get a lot of these fossils, but they destroy them. How would we create some awareness of local communities where there might be archaeological gold mines to know their importance? And how would we make universities be involved and even students to go into these areas for research so that we can bridge the gaps in archaeological research and historical questions? Thank you.
Thank you. Military hardware, I wouldn't be surprised to find that in the lake, because when the Europeans came, they camped in Kisumu, and they had a caravan of natives going all the way to Trans Nzoia. And my grandfather used to say, if you found a small box, you will be better off not taking it, because it ended up normally the heaviest. So I think that is the one that was carrying bullets. So I suspect that some people will collapse and die, or just throw these things into the lake and escape. So that's possible. Rock art, most rock art you find on buildings, I think probably Onjala will talk about that. So he can capture that in his talk. The writings are there. As I said, most of these things can be. Cesar Bitter was my student. He did anthropology before, and then he was employed by the National Museum before he ventured into water archaeology, underwater archaeology. And when we talk of underwater archaeology, we are not just restricting that to the ocean. We also know that there is archaeology in large water masses like Lake Victoria. So it is a question of having people with the necessary training to go into those areas that have not yet been investigated. Now, religious studies and archaeology are very closely linked. The scrolls that have been found in the Holy Land have added a lot of information on what is known about Jewish culture and also Christianity. So you are not in the wrong place, you are just in the right place. Then the question that Dr. Kriyama raised, heritage, it's just that people don't know. You see, if you look at the Luo and the Luya, the Luo and the Abakusi, there is a lot of borrowing from either side. Language may be a problem. And if you look at, for example, the Luya potters and the Luo potters who use Kiboswa market, if you are not very keen, you will not know which is a Luya pot and which is a Luo pot. So there is a lot of cultural in the borrowing. The problem in Kenya is not the ordinary people. The problem in Kenya are politicians who tell you that you are a Bukusu, so you have to vote for Weta. And because Weta is in NASA, you have to vote for. So they are the people who emphasize ethnic diversity because their political survival depends on that. One way you went to Kwale High School. You had never heard of Kwale High School? All the way from Kisii. Then you met Dr. Nangendo there from Bungoma, who you had never met. And you have been friends through and through. So, when I came to Kenyatta College to do my A-levels, I met people who were talking like they were climbing a hill. And I discovered that they come from where Frida comes from. As ordinary people, we know that we depend on each other. Even militarily, the warriors would never kill a woman or a child. That was part of the loot. And the other thing is that you do not annihilate your enemy because you will depend on them for exchange for material goods as well as wives. So you only teach them a lesson, and then you go. They will come and teach you a lesson, and they go. So these are the concepts that we have to emphasize in our school curriculum and use material culture objects to emphasize that. like a pot made by blah blah. When I was doing research in Murang'a, and I got a pot, and I said, I'd ask this woman, this is not a Kikuyu pot. She said, how do you know? I said, I know. He said, no, oh yeah, this is actually a Luo pot. Now, why are you making a Luo pot? Because somebody, a customer, wanted a pot like a Luo pot. So she brought the actual pot and gave this potter to use as a model. And the customer was not a Luo, the customer was actually a Kikuyu. So maybe that is what we need to do. Finally, I think the mode fathers, as you know, mode, there are some things that come and then they die a natural death. Like when Pete Robert Shaw and David who? Collett. Yeah. When they were conducting research, David Collett told me, he was doing his PhD, and he said, you know, you came up with these terminologies, or the Paso-Neolithic pottery, and all you did was basic analysis. So we went into technical analysis. And I think the idea was to discredit, but unfortunately it didn't work for them. So now he came up, if you have read that article they say Maasai nonsensical terms that they apply to pottery, which have died a natural death. So the same thing with the use of modes instead of early Stone Age, is that run out of currency, and nobody talks about them. If you read a new book, nobody talks about those modes, because there are distinctions, whether there's cultural continuity or not. Even within cultural change, there will still be continuity.
I believe everyone has had either a cup of tea, something to drink, or something to bite. And in the interest of time, I would suggest that we start. So we are now moving into the second session. I just wanted to take this opportunity to say very briefly that the idea of having this get-together workshop is, we thought it was important for Kenyan researchers, especially prehistoric researchers or archaeologists, to come together and share ideas on things they are doing, because there are very interesting things that we are doing in different ways, different areas, but we don't have a forum in which we can be able to share with one another, know what is happening, and hopefully inspire the collaboration and multi-institutional linkages among ourselves. So that synergy within ourselves has been missing, and that's why we thought it'd be a good idea to have all of us sit down, discuss the great ideas, the things we are doing, and what are the possible ways. So some of us are collaborating with different institutions, the opportunities, what are the opportunities for the young upcoming scholars, what are other ways we can do so we are not stuck in the same, using the same old methods or whatever, when people are moving and doing other things. So what other opportunities are there? So the presentations, therefore, that are going to happen are not meant to, yes, to give you, provoke scientific thought, but also to just give you a glimpse of what are the areas, what are the thoughts, what is happening. And from that, when we move into the round table discussions tomorrow, what is that we can be able to come up with? How can we forge in both individual collaborations and also at the institutional level? How can we look forward to having a program where maybe University of Nairobi have a joint project with National Museums of Kenya, or Jaramogi Oginga Odinga University has a project with Kenyatta University or Maseno University. So that way we can be able to mentor students and also even acquire this equipment. We are talking about equipment that we are unable to secure, because in many cases we apply as either as one institution or even as individuals, and that does not improve our chances of getting these grants to get this equipment. But if we work collaboratively and we are able to come together and put in a joint grant saying that we need this equipment, if it's an isotope lab, we need an isotope lab that's going to serve the regions within this, for example, here in Kenya, I'm sure that kind of proposals will be looked at favorably. So that is the whole idea behind this, that we can be able to come together, see how we can also do cross-disciplinary collaboration, so that we are not just talking among ourselves, but how can we also cross over to other disciplines and see various ways in which we can be able to collaborate together and improve our chances and also inspire knowledge among others. Because you realize actually, like from last year's ranking in major discoveries, African countries are actually coming up, especially in the area of human origins or origin sciences. It's one area that we are shining, but how can we seize that opportunity when use archaeology as a tool, or as not only as an element for our own cultural development, but also for economic development? How can we come up with ideas? And number three, how can we use archaeology to make good science that we can be able to provide, publish papers, come up with major papers that make international headlines? You saw last week, actually, last week or 2 weeks ago, when there was major paper publications for Ologasaile. Yeah, like it made more than 200 international news agencies were able to take the story either in front page and print and electronic media. And Science, Nature projected that they had up to about 500 million viewers who were able to see share the story. But unfortunately, here in Kenya, I'm not sure did any media coverage cover that? No. There was no coverage at all in Kenya, blank. While the story that was making international headlines was here in Kenya. And where are we as, of course, local scholars? Like, how can we put our foot together and make that? Okay, I now give Dr. Kiama the floor to take us into this discussion and see what kind of work they are doing. And we'll start with recent excavations in Pate Highland.
Good morning once more. I'll just talk briefly on the work we have been doing in Pate. Semi-archaeological, because we did excavations, but more it is about heritage and identity. How do you use excavations to understand the local politics, the local people? But here what I'll be presenting is mostly the archaeology part of it. Okay. Pate, for those who don't know, is in the Kenya coast, and is one of, Pate is two. Pate is the name of the island and is the name of the town. And Pate town has got two sections. There's an old Pate and there is also a new Pate. There are 4 islands which make the Lamu archipelago, no, in fact several, but the major ones are Pate, Manda, and Lamu Island. And then there are several other small islands which make the archipelago. Is that clear? Can you see that? Barely.
So we have a rough idea.
Yeah, you have, because this is the Pate Island. This is the Pate Island, and the town is somewhere down here. Those who have read Makoton's book Shanga, Shanga is also a town which is found on the Pate Island. But our work was on the Pate town itself, which is currently one of the few inhabited historical towns that we have in East Africa. The other one is Lamu, and of course there is Zanzibar and Kilwa. You can't see that, I'm sure, but what you can see, this is the makeup of the entire Pate town, and historically they say Pate had 7 gates. It was a walled town, or this is the town wall, where we have dots. This is what has broken down, but all these others are intact. And then they had 7 gates, and each gate had a name, either depending on where it faced. Like here we have what they call the CU gate, because this is the gate we'll use to go to CU. Then down here we have what Mlango wa Pwani, or the door of the coast, because it's the one which they could use to go through to the seashore. This is the sea here. And then we have what several other gates here. But then the work we did, though they say that historically there were 7 gates, but when we were counting them with the elders, we got 9 gates. But there is, and then we were told, depending on who tells you what, the gates will vary depending on. So the major gates are 7, and then there are other 2 smaller gates. Several excavations have been carried in Pate. We are not the first people to go there. They started with Neville Chitik, who was, I think, the first director of the British Institute. And when we were students, British Institute was at Jiromo campus. You remember we used to go there and he used to tell us, you guys, you have got no business of being archaeologists. When Mwalimia could tell us to go and look for books there. Well, so he was the first person to excavate Pate, but his aim of excavating was he wanted to confirm that what was said in the Pate Chronicle carried what he excavated. And unfortunately is that his method of excavation is what we cannot call ethical, because he was only looking for imported pottery. So anything which he thought which was locally made, like the earthenware that Fred has been studying, that wasn't important to him, was throwing away. So because he wanted to confirm the theories that people had at those times, that anything good, quote and quotes, originated from outside. So anything which was local, he threw away. And in that way, we lost a lot of material which he had excavated. Then there were all these guys, Usam Gaida, George Abungu, Tom Wilson, who did excavations. And then in 2008, me and Busolo, that time both were working for the National Museum in the coast. We went to Lamu as part of a project which had been funded by Norwegian, I don't know what I can call it, a philanthropist, because this guy was interested in Portuguese heritage, and he said that he wanted the National Museums to carry out work on Portuguese heritage in the coast. So he funded that to go to Pate and carry out some excavations on one of the places. And one of the places we did was Pate Kanisani, or the church, and it was supposed to be the old church in but unfortunately this guy is now very sick, and we are told that he may die in time soon. But he has been he was very instrumental in our excavations in the coast. So then why is Pate important? One is that it has played an important role in the history of the coast. When the Portuguese came to the coast in 1488, Pate was one of the richest towns that they found on the coast. In fact, they say that the silk which was produced in Pate, it was unrivaled. That was so nice and so good and so expensive. And then also Pate, as I said, is one of the communities in the coast which has got a recorded history. We have got the Pate Chronicles, we have got the Lamu Chronicles, we have the Kilo Chronicles. Those are the few towns in the coast which have got the history recorded. And then there's got a very rich funerary tradition. So they have got good cemeteries. When you go to those cemeteries, they are recording the history of the town. So you can even use that to collaborate what you can get from archaeological evidence. So, but unfortunately is that unlike other places like Shang or Manda, still we haven't seen large-scale and systematic excavations carried out in Pate. And what we did in 2015 was also a small excavation as part of a PhD study by a student